Morals in Man, Part 9. But faced with the constant and increasing breakdown of marriage in our days, we are tempted to try to remedy the situation by still going further along the path that has led us to it. We try to cover up our loss of the sense of depth and dignity and creative purpose by a recourse to that, quote, exaggerated physiological education, unquote, against which Pius XI warned us. And there is every need of his warning. For the education of which he speaks, which teaches, quote, rather the art of sinning in a subtle way, unquote, than the art of loving, is in fact in danger of carrying yet further the trend which makes sex simply a plaything, supplying a mass of facts which may indeed be used for the greater happiness of mankind, but which we are liable, from the presuppositions on which they are based, to drive the fundamental truths yet further and further into the background. Here again we must be careful to distinguish. For if there is a physiological education which does more harm than good, there is, on the other hand, an attitude of mind which errs in the opposite direction, and robs the young of an equipment without which marriage may indeed survive, and which in a primitive community might well be irrelevant, but which undoubtedly in our own civilization can be a necessity. Sexual harmony will not of itself make a happy marriage, or a lasting one. It would be nonsense to say, look after sex and love, it will look after itself. But on the other hand, it is not wholly possible to say the converse. Love will overcome most difficulties if it is deep and generous enough. But it is unhappily possible for two people who sincerely love each other to find their marriage ruined, or at any rate beset with endless difficulty and sorrow, owing to a physical disharmony which might easily have been avoided. Quite unconsciously, the man may say, through ignorance of a few physical or psychological principles, inflict upon a woman a hurt in which will issue in a definite and all but ineradicable antipathy. There is need, not indeed, of the instruction which merely sets out to provide as large a number as possible of variations on the theme of sex the plaything, but of the instruction which enables a man to understand a woman and vice versa, and so provides, before marriage, a fund of understanding which, destroying neither the sense of mystery nor the spontaneity of love, may guard against the danger of inflicting damage and pain. For the Christian, the physical aspect of marriage, so far from being unimportant on the one hand or of supreme importance exclusively in its own right on the other, is an important human element in one whole thing, the supernaturalized human life. Hence, the Christian recognizes that education must not be allowed to leave the boy or girl in ignorance of what is necessary to achieve the success of the physical element in marriage, of its importance as an element in a psychophysical experience, of the moral problems which it gives rise. And he has a program which he can advocate fearlessly because he is confident of its truth. He has definite principles to put forward which he knows will make for the curing of disorder and the procuring of happiness. He has an answer to the dilemma proposed by modern opinions and the disorder to which they give rise. At the same time, since we are Christians, we are not likely to be immune from the dangers we discern in contemporary society. It is for us to make sure that our own house is set in order, that we ourselves are successfully putting the principles of Christianity into practice. Education means essentially, not filling the child's mind with an infinity of facts, mathematical, historical, linguistic, and the rest, but preparing him through a unified development and formation of his personality at all its levels, sense awareness, mind, heart, and character, to make his own life for himself when the days of school or university are over. It does not mean that he will have no more to learn, but that he will know how to learn. Not that he will never have to think or judge, but that he will know how to think and judge. His life, his career in the fullest sense, is something that he has to create for himself. He has to achieve his perfection. Now, the normal development of man is not solitary. It implies marriage. Education, then, must envisage marriage as the normal means of perfection, must in consequence see that the boy or girl is fitted to learn, think, and judge sufficiently and correctly about marriage and all that it applies. The child passes through various stages of increasing sex awareness, each of which presents him with problems to be solved, questions to be answered, and a failure to answer them on the part of those whose duty it is may result in mental stress at the time and possibly faulty development later on. What is here more immediately to the point is that even when the child is told about the act of intercourse itself, and very few children seem to know more about marriage than that when they go out into the world, though they normally acquire a great deal of irrelevant or harmful information about sex, the implication is that it is all he needs to know. It is precisely here that the tragedy lies. Not so much that he lacks detailed information as that the little he has is supposed to be sufficient, and therefore gives him a wholly materialist view of marriage. Materialist, and in another sense Cartesian, in both ways anti-Christian. Cartesian because there is the complete dichotomy. You spend your life with another person, you talk and eat together. Then on the other hand, there are those recurring physical acts, and between the two parts of married life, no real connection, no interaction, no influence is recognized. Materialist, therefore, because those physical acts themselves are regarded as simple, animal, and pleasing, but somewhat mechanical procedure. It is no good blinding our eyes to the facts, saying that this is all very exaggerated, and that, of course, young people get along quite well and are quite happy and not nearly so complex as the theorist is apt to make them out to be. The facts will not be gainsaid. Too often marriages are not happy in any real, complete sense. People do, quote, get along quite well, unquote, and that is exactly the mystery of it. They make a compromise with fate. They accept a dull, neutral, jog-trot sort of life as better than a lot of fuss, and resign themselves to it. It is worth examining the dichotomy of physical from psychical more closely. In its roots, it is but one instance of the effect that conventional residue of morality to which Christian principles have shrunk in our society. Goodness is presented, if presented at all, in terms of a negative morality. Christianity, which gives life to law through its creative ideal of growth towards something, of the making of a whole personality in touch with God through and through, and consequently of the use of all the elements of life to promote that growth. All this is lacking. All the result is that a young man or woman will feel that certain things are forbidden, and so many try to avoid them. But there the influence of morality will stop, and the recurrent physical acts will remain wholly unrelated to any idea of an organic sharing in the dynamic evolution of the person. It is for the Christian, then, that the emphasis that religion is a teleological thing, a life, and a life not distinguished or amorphous but unified. And unified because aiming through all the diverse elements that go to make it up at one end. One of those elements is sex. And the important thing in the present context is that sex is not just an animal thing. The personality cannot be split up. And what is done primarily, or rather materially speaking, on one plane affects every other. What is done to or by the body affects the mind. What is done to or by the heart affects the body, and so on. And if the physical element in life is wrong, every other element will be affected also. Hence the tragedy of the materialist view of sex. The young man and woman have gone out into the world equipped with the barest rudiments of the physiologically of sexual intercourse, and not warned that this meager equipment is totally insufficient if they are going to be married. What happens? The man has no idea that this is an art which has to be learned like any other art, that it is a delicate thing that needs infinitely delicate handling. He does his best, and his best is to behave like a bull in a china shop. The woman is hurt either physically or psychologically or both, and that impression once made may never be eradicated. The thing may be ruined, and love may, and often does, turn into hate. This is no abstract theorizing. The doctor's casebooks vouch for this truth. Two absolutely necessary things were lacking: a deeper, more adequate knowledge of sex itself, and a recognition of the psychophysical unity of man, and chaos is the result. Even when complete ruin does not result, the same cause will at any rate prevent the success of marriage, will devitalize instead of perfecting, will bring about disintegration instead of union. The perfect act is that in which both man and woman arrive simultaneously at its climax, but they are differently made. The woman is normally slower in her reactions than the man, and this means that there must be careful adjustment. Preliminaries, desirable in themselves, become an absolute necessity in order that the rhythm of the slower partner may catch up, so to say, with that of the other. Similarly, if the union is to be creative, perfecting and completing, and not exasperating, there must not be a sudden sensation, but a gradual diminuendo of intensity. The preliminaries must be paralleled by analogous care as epilogue. The conscious or unconscious brutality which omits either of these things will breed hate, not love, because the resultant tension and disharmony where there should be quiescence and completion will inevitably react on the mind. Physical maladjustment must always tend to lead to psychical antipathy. There is a further danger to be considered, that of false moral standings which bring about the same results. Conventional morality, as it is in fact, exists in the produce in the mind of the child a fear, more or less prurient, of the body and its functions insofar as these latter are vaguely regarded as shameful. He has to be aware, if he is to be respectable, of breaking the rules. The temper of mind which takes the word immorality to mean exclusively sexual sin is not absent from our education, but the rules themselves are vague, for they are not counterbalanced by any recognition of a morality or affirmation. Hence the danger that the young man or woman may come to regard the act of physical union as something which may be indulged in legitimately indeed, but always rather shamefacedly. always perhaps in the subconscious fear that anything other than the strict necessities will be sinful. Quote, "With my body I thee worship," unquote. The Christian liturgy bids the bridegroom say, but how is this to be reconciled with all that he has been taught? How indeed can it be true unless union is creative as well as procreative, contemplative and not merely a brief physical activity? Contemplative. Here we return to the social evils with which these private tragedies are related. The first evil consequence of these latter is evident, for how shall children not suffer who are begotten in this atmosphere and reared in a household the key of which is not the joy of dynamic growth in love and unified experience, but the deadly disintegration of a static compromise? And what chance is there for them of a stable and happy family life, without which, as foundation, a stable and happy political society is impossible? A happy atmosphere in the home is dependent mainly on the existence of a happy and stable husband and wife. This union is too often affected by the factors which have been discussed, and they have been discussed at some length because they are as avoidable as they are disastrous. But it would be very short-sighted to suppose that once all this is put right, there remains nothing further to be done. Evils of this kind may well wreck a marriage. Their absence does not necessarily mean a happy marriage. A marriage which has no further basis than a physical attraction would have little chance of survival. If there is to be real union in personalities, there must be a marriage of true minds and a deep unity of will. We speak of love-making rightly, since love is not just the enjoyment of something given, but something dropped ready-made from the skies, but the gradual, patient, and sometimes painful making of what is not there to begin with, and the making of every level of our psychophysical life. A marriage which had no other basis than a physical attraction would have had little chance of survival. If there is to be a real union of personalities, there must be a, quote, marriage of true minds, unquote, and a deep unity of will. We speak of love-making rightly, since love is not only just the enjoyment of something given, something dropped ready-made from the skies, but the gradual, patient, and sometimes painful making of what is not there to begin with, and a making which involves every level of our psychophysical life. The more deeply we come to know people, the more we realize how scanty our understanding of them really is. A human being is a mystery, and therefore, like other mysteries, is to be approached with great reverence and humility, and in the sure knowledge that a mystery cannot be learnt in a day or a year, or without long and patient effort. It is often hard for two men or two women to understand each other because of their differences of mental calibre, of background, tradition, upbringing, of prejudices and presuppositions. It is much harder for a man and a woman to understand each other because, as a rule, there is between them, besides all the individual differences, a difference of psychological types. Men tend to think that women are irrational, women that men's minds are of use only within the narrow confines of science, economics, commercial affairs. Certainly one cannot generalize without great caution, because no human being is wholly masculine or wholly feminine. But it seems true to say that for the most part men are more predominantly rational, which is not to say that their thoughts and words and actions are always reasonable, and that women are more predominantly intuitive, which is not to say that their intuitions are always valid. It follows that the marriage of such minds can be particularly valuable precisely because of their differences make them complementary. They can correct, enrich, complete each other. But also follows that the task of mutual understanding is likely to be an arduous one. Young married couples sometimes think, when they have their first quarrel, that all is over. On the contrary, it may just begin. The real union has to be achieved through toil and perhaps tears. Then there's the unity of heart, of will, to be made. No two people, however deeply in love, can expect to find that their needs or desires, their tastes, moods, interests, impulses will always be in harmony. Nor can it even be said that their differences will be constant and therefore to that extent manageable, for we are feckless creatures, and our moods and impulses are largely unpredictable. But unity of heart does not mean the elimination of every difference. It does mean that gradually, underneath all the superficial differences, a deep, basic unity of purpose is achieved. Ti voglio bene, Italian lovers say. If love is to be deep and enduring, if it is really to achieve a real union of personalities, it must be based on the will to make one life out of two, to make it gradually, patiently, lovingly, as the years go by, at every level of life, and to make it in the knowledge that difficulties must often arise, perhaps the very great ones, but that they can be material of an increase in the depth and richness of life. Christians are given the sacrament of marriage partly to help them in this making of love and in overcoming the difficulties they must face, not only in the making of their own love, but in the making of the family and in defending it against the various dangers, economic or social or perhaps political, which may beset it. But the sacrament is given also that man and wife may make their life and their home something not merely humanly, but divinely lovely. Lovely in vitam aeternam, leading to and forever rejoicing in eternal life. We have, therefore, here as elsewhere, to safeguard the primary rights of the human personality and of the family. But we have also to set against the counterfeit and the subhuman, and the only partially human, the full richness and dignity and depth of marriage, not only as officium naturae, as the natural way of fulfillment of human life and love, but also as sacramentum, as effective symbol of the union of Christ with his church. As in the other sacraments, says St. Thomas, quote, spiritual reality is shown forth in figure in the performance of external ceremony, so in this sacrament the union of man and woman is the figure of Christ and his church, according to the words of the apostle, sacramentum hoc magnum est, ego autem dico in Christo et in ecclesia. And because the sacraments effect what they signify, it is to be believed that on those who marry is conferred a grace whereby they are drawn into the union of Christ and his church, and this is supremely necessary for them, in order that they may in such a wise concern themselves with fleshly and earthly things as not to be separated from Christ and from the church. Unquote. Creators, king and queen, amicus and amica, symbols of the indissoluble union of Christ and the church, and channels through which the grace of the sacrament is conferred. All this is in a different world from the world of superficial hedonism and selfishness and counterfeit with which we are so often confronted today. Not in these, but only in those, is the basis of the real human life, the promise of real human perfection, and therefore the making of the good society. A nation in which the idea of love, marriage, family is disintegrating is itself in process of disintegration. Insofar as, today, love is in fact losing its fullness of meaning, marriage its depth, the family its unity and community and independence of life, the nation is threatened, and ultimately, world. Chapter 11. The Peaceful Somnolence of Christianity. The peaceful somnolence of Christianity. How grotesque it sounds to the Christian, yet sometimes how true. True insofar as we have made it so. The writer is speaking of a Catholic church. Elaine went in from the rough and tumble of the street and shut out the noise of the world, quote, with a little leather-padded door which sighed indulgently as it swung on its hinges, unquote. Writers of this sentimentally pious sort sometimes make much of this tranquility. The heroine enters the building. The, quote, little leather-padded door, unquote, swings softly to, and in the earthly solemn stillness which supervenes upon the bustle of sublunary life, great and wonderful thoughts steal gently upon the soul. The little leather door is the gate of paradise, not because through it one comes to the altar at which Mass is offered, Mass during which, as had been truly said, the curtain of time is rolled back and one really does step into eternity, because into union with an eternal act, but, on the contrary, because the building itself is invested with a quality of timelessness from the mere fact that one cannot hear the traffic. That a church should be quiet is obviously necessary, but what it is that makes it so, or rather, what is it that produces the atmosphere, in fact discernible in it, demands scrutiny. What is the reality for which timelessness is the pious novelist's perhaps unwarranted label? Is it truer, perhaps, to say that it is not a reality, but precisely an escape from reality? If there were no such thing as distraction, we should all go out of our minds. A too prolonged concentration on any job, physical or mental, is apt to lead to a breakdown. Quote, a man needs pleasure as a physic against the manifold troubles and sorrows of life, unquote. Human existence being what it is, we often need a means of relief from the stress of troubles and anxieties which threaten to crush the spirit. But we have to distinguish between two sorts of seeking for relief: recreation and escapism. Finding relief in work or wine or music or travel or prayer is very different from finding oblivion in drink or in drugs. To make the grand tour is one of the classic methods of healing a broken heart. For the efficacy of the grape in uplifting the spirit, we have, among a host of other eulogies, the authority of the arch-poet himself. Poculus ascenditur, animi lucerna, cor imbutum nectare volat ad superna. To relieve the nervous exasperation due to exacting task, an insistent worry, by playing a Brandenburg is not to escape from reality, but on the contrary to find new energy for activity in one sphere of reality by imbibing it from another. We hope that, the Brandenburg ended, the spirit will find itself invigorated, renewed, that the work in hand will progress more successfully, the anxiety be faced with greater calm. So St. Thomas took not to flight, but to praying when the prolonged struggle of his speculation could find no issue. Prayer is of the nature the opposite of escapism, for it is the means of energizing the spirit for the business of living, while being at the same time for the prayerful man a liberation and a refreshment. very different to induce in oneself the unreality of torpor, to look for repose not in due degree and as a temporary measure, but as a complete and exclusive policy of life. This would be merely universal defeatism. Religion is, of course, a comfort for the troubled mind and heart, and this is true not merely in the fundamental sense that the world is well lost if God be found, but also in the sense that we are right to take advantage of any emotional and sensuous relief which the practice of religion may provide. God is not likely to take umbrage if overwrought nerves or burdened mind find solace in the silence and the tranquility of his house. And in general, while the senses and emotions are not the basis of religion, they have their place in it. Worship is not a purely intellectual thing, for it is the whole man who must pay homage to God, not merely the mind. What then is the religious escapism against which we have to guard? It is the turning of religion completely into a search for emotional and sensuous indulgence, using the pleasure with which may be found in religion's outward appetences simply to forget its inner reality, and so failing to face the problems of every day in the light and with the strength for which religion should afford. Evelyn Underhill remarked how the emotional element necessary in the spiritual life may become, quote, merely an oblique indulgence of lower cravings, unquote. The mere longing for protection, for petting, for rest. This is the danger which we have to guard, lest religion become the service not of God but of ourselves. And it is for this reason that the criticism so often leveled against a fashion of church furnishing and public worship, now happily on the decline, from the papal directives on liturgy to the everyday discussions on repository art, are primarily not aesthetic, but theological. The divorce of religion from life has not an unusual sermon subject. It is not right, we are rightly told, to come to church on Sundays and be self-seeking pagans throughout the week. Religion is not one of the many departments of life. It is not even the most important department of life. If it is religion at all, it must mean the elevation of the whole of life into a new mode. The Christian life is not divided into two series of activities, the one carried out upon the natural plane, as shaving, working, enjoying a Brandenburg, the other upon the supernatural plane. By virtue of the supernatural vitality bestowed on the Christian, every natural activity is caught up in a wider sphere of reality, is given new meaning and purpose, becomes operative as a means of the acquiring of an end above and beyond the natural end of man. And if there is no aspect of life, however small and insignificant, into which the efficacy of grace does not penetrate, if on the contrary every problem and every reversal is to be met by the whole united personality, integrally supernaturalized, then obviously there can be no question of, quote, peaceful somnolence, unquote, for the Christian. There can be no question of an opiate for the people. There can be no congruity in proposing or providing a worship and a place of worship to be more than a peaceful haven for the bothered soul. There is no room for a little padded door in any but the most material sense. How is it that the undeniably existing dichotomy has come about? There are the unrealities already referred to, but the trouble goes much deeper than that. There is the view that the retention of a Latin liturgy means the exclusion of all but a few from any full participation in the Church's worship, and from this it is argued that the liturgy cannot but be ineffective in relation to the everyday affairs. There is surely a great deal of truth in this contention. Even among those who understand Latin, few find it as alive and cogent as their mother tongue. For the vast majority, there is the English missal, perhaps, but the fact remains that for them the priest is speaking in an unknown tongue, the thing lifted out of the realm of immediate contact, and only a great effort of concentration on the substance of what is going forward can make the reality of it vital to the onlooker. In the prayers of the Mass, there is no lack of reference to the world of everyday affairs, but they are liable to pass unnoticed. The advantages of a Latin liturgy are obvious enough, but those opponents of the vernacular who are either armchair liturgists or have to deal only with cultured and liturgically well-educated congregations might well acquaint themselves with conditions in some of our larger and poorer parishes where the mass of the people read even their own language only with a certain difficulty in Latin, not all. There they would realize the sense of futility which must overtake anyone who finds himself obliged, in baptisms, churchings, even, and above all, the Mass, to read out long prayers which to the hearers are gibberish. Where the Mass is concerned, it is difficult to regard as a perfect arrangement the expedient of reading out an English version of the epistle and gospel while the priest is reading them in Latin, or, even worse, as part of the notices long after the priest has finished them. As is to be hoped, the time may soon come when every public low Mass will be a dialogue Mass. Ought we not consider, for instance, whether it is really intelligent for the people to say the Gloria or Credo in Latin while trying to keep one eye on the English translation, so as to know that they are what they are talking about? Or whether, again, it is really intelligent to be saying Dominus vobiscum et cum spiritu tuo, when they might be saying God be with you and with you. A Catholic, that is, a universal, liturgy must of its nature be such as can be easily understood by simple people, and not only understood but actively shared in. Can we maintain that our liturgy as we have it in the present is like that? If we are realist, we are not bound to say that, on the balance, while there is everything to be said for keeping the canon of the Mass, and of course the actual forms of the other sacraments, the formulas of baptism or of absolution from sin, in Latin, there is equally everything to be said for having the rest in English, but on one condition, and it is an essential condition, that the English should really be English and not some sort of Italo-Latin jargon. But again, the trouble goes deeper than that any question of language. During the past half hour she had been thinking, and she had come to the conclusion that she really loved life with all its imperfections and all its drawbacks. She suddenly felt a loathing for the negative state of perfection, dictated to her by her conscience. The negative state of perfection. It is worth inquiring whether the state of perfection envisaged by the average Christian is not too often too negative. There is a danger that life in its moral aspect may be viewed not as a progress towards an end, the making of a godly personality, the acquisition of a habitual state of mind and will, but simply as an avoidance of breakages of rules, themselves mentally formulated as prohibitions. The word charity, for example, then suggests first the possibility of having been guilty of sins of thought, word, and deed, rather than the fact that love is the stuff of the Christian life, growth in which meant growth in perfection, in richness, in the power to achieve the end. The whole idea of the virtues as habitual gracious qualities of the soul gives place to an absorption at best in actions consonant with, at worst in actions contrary to, a code. The result is that religion ceases to mean the positive rhythm and pattern of a God-filled life, ceases therefore to influence the making of plans or the ruling of conduct except insofar as it imposes negative restrictions, laying down what may not be done, but not suggesting that what may and should. The Christian, in other words, when planning some project, may think that in its execution this or that must be avoided. He may not think of the whole business as part of his religion, his Christian life, and religion therefore may play the part of a policeman, not, as it ought, of a dynamic center. Quote, there she was at the age of 32, without ever having done anything really wrong in her life, unquote. She had never done anything really wrong because she had never done anything at all. She had always been a good negativist. Rien ne fait rien. Not to give other people pain, not to annoy everyone, to efface oneself if called upon to do so. These were the precepts she had nurtured in her soul. Small wonder she was dim, frustrated, a failure. Did she feel any better, she asked herself, for having striven after integrity for so long? No, for indeed the whole reason of her failure was that she had misunderstood the nature of integrity. How can integrity be found in negation? In integrity, which means completeness, integral fulfillment. And when Christian integrity is viewed as a negation of wrongdoing, how can the result be other than death, even though the soul may think itself a success, since, like Elaine, it has never broken the rules? The most horrible kind of death is that which masquerades as life, and the most dreadful spectacle is that of the soul which thinks itself successful and has, in fact, achieved nothing, is not alive at all. That, without the supernatural, a man cannot be truly integral. That religion is what integrates him, or may integrate him if he will, that it fills him, his natural self, with life as a room is suddenly filled with light, that it means in consequence not a negative code, but a creative evolution of which the code is but the external formulation. This is the lesson of Christianity. It is by learning this lesson that the danger of somnolescence is best avoided, for it is in this light of this lesson that worship is inadequately estimated, the Mass occupying its proper central position in the sum of human homage, the chief means whereby life is bestowed. The ite missa est is not the end of a spectacle which one has observed, but the beginning of a day in which one is to live. The little leather-padded door will not cease to sigh indulgently for the oppressed who seek peace of mind and soul, but it will be very far from symbolizing an be-cushioned tranquility of escapism, the somnolence of reality of a religion divorced from life.